Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this UFM Lou Douglas lecture. I'm John Fleiter, Associate Professor of Political Science at Kansas State University and the chair of the UFM Lou Douglas Lecture Series Advisory Board. Our lecture series is named after Lou Douglas, a distinguished professor of political science at Kansas State from 1949 until 1977, who is widely known for his power to inspire students, faculty, and citizens, to instigate change, and to motivate grassroots organizations and individuals to pursue social justice in politics, economics, and foreign policy. Following the lecture, there will be a question and answer period. Feel free to ask questions. We ask that you come to the mic so that everyone can hear the questions that you have, one of these mics. If you need to leave after the lecture, please do so quietly so others can hear the discussion. Mr. Feingold's book will be on sale, and he'll be signing books in the foyer following the lecture. At this time, I would like to introduce former Kansas Governor John Carlin, who will introduce our speaker. Governor Carlin is currently visiting professor and executive in residence in the School of Leadership Studies. Please welcome Governor Carlin.
Thank you, John, and good evening to all of you. I'm well aware that you have a lot of the important facts about our distinguished guest in the program. I know you came to hear him, so let me be very quick in introducing our very distinguished guest. Senator Feingold, yes, is a Democrat. Yes, he's a progressive. But for me, what's most important, he's independent. He was one of the few that really represented his own thinking, represented the interest of his constituents against quite frequently what a caucus might have wanted or a special interest. It's what made him unique in the United States Senate and makes him a very special presenter for our lecture series tonight, Senator Russ Feingold.
Good evening, everybody. It's good to be here. It's my first time in Kansas, other than a brief event in Kansas City once. So it's a beautiful place. It was a beautiful day, and I'm impressed with the university here, the faculty, and the students that I had a chance to spend a little bit of time with. Congratulations on your football team. We love our football team, the Badgers, but we're having a little bit of a rockier start this year. But what an impressive record. Good luck. I've heard so much about this West Virginia game, I'm going to be a little more focused on it than I would have been otherwise. It's an honor to be giving a Lou Douglas lecture. I've heard about him and the distinguished lectures that have occurred here, I guess, all the way back to 1980. So it is an honor to be here. It is an honor to be introduced by John Carlin. We in Wisconsin have admired the governor for many years. I mean, just the fact that a Democrat got elected here, we're fascinated by. But he represents to me the kind of class and outreach to all kinds of people and manner that made me want to go into politics, this kind of person. So thank you for the introduction and for your service here. I served with a lot of great people in the United States Senate, and quite a few of them were from Kansas. I had a wonderful experience with Bob Dole, whose word was gold. You didn't need to write things down with Bob. If he told you got to offer an amendment, even though I was a pain in the neck on the other side, it was solid as a rock. Nancy Kassebaum was one of my favorite senators. I served with her in working on Africa-related issues. And I even noticed once I was listening to Arlen Specter speaking, who just passed away, and I thought, that's funny. He's from Philadelphia, and he kind of sounds like Bob Dole. And then I realized they're both from Russell, Kansas. So I had many good experiences with Kansans. I would have enjoyed serving with a Democrat senator from Kansas, but I guess that's just not done around here. You can do it anytime you want, though, from my point of view. I know that this is the preeminent political event occurring tonight in the United States of America. So I want you to know that no offense will be taken for those who want to be on time to see the beginning of the debate. I'm concerned about it as well. I'm going to stay here and sign books, and I'll catch up later. But it's a big deal, and it's a big deal for your future, what's going to happen this presidential election. So I hope you'll follow this by following the debate and watching what's going to happen this evening, which is, as I indicated, about as important as it can be. Having said all that, I was asked to talk about 3 topics, and they're all topics I usually give full lectures on. So I'm going to give you about 12 or 13 minutes on what's wrong with our campaign finance system, then another 12 or 13 minutes on what's wrong with the United States Senate, and then about 12 or 13 minutes on what's wrong with our foreign policy and our international policy. And then we'll take questions. That's supposed to be a joke, but that's what I'm going to try to do. So somebody said it's a Kansas sampler or something like that. So anyway, let me try to do that. Just hit some highlights, because these are all things that people are concerned about. You may have heard that things have gotten really bad with our campaign finance system. We pay for our elections. And I suppose many people say, well, but it's always been like that. Money in politics, they're always going to be there. Money always finds a way. And in some ways, that's true. I mean, I assume even in the great Athenian democracy that began democracy in this world, that they had problems with money in politics, okay? But something has happened in the last couple of years that has dramatically changed our system of elections in this country that has not happened before, or at least not for 100 years. And anyone tells you it's just the same as it always was, they're covering up. The fact is that the United States Supreme Court single-handedly changed the way we run elections by a 5-4 decision 2 years ago in a case called Citizens United. Now, how can one Supreme Court case do that? This is how. Well over 100 years ago, the people of this country, in places like Wisconsin and Kansas, were suffering from the domination of our country and our democracy by corporate power. And the people in the Plain States, the populists and the progressives and those in Wisconsin rose up and said, we want some control over these monopolies. We don't want 3 beef companies to control all the beef in the country. We don't want the oil companies to be able to dominate us. And the progressive era occurred. And various laws were passed near the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century to try to control this unlimited power. One of them was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which provided for action against monopolies such as the oil companies. We went to the direct election of senators instead of by corrupt state legislatures, passed a constitutional amendment to do that. But another law that was passed in 1907 was called the Tillman Act. And the Tillman Act is a law signed by Teddy Roosevelt, Republican president, that said that, you know what, we can't have corporations completely controlling our democracy. They cannot use their money from their corporate treasuries to control elections or to run for money to support candidates. They thought it was too corrupting of our democracy. And so that was the law of the land until 2 years ago. Nobody ever questioned it. What does it mean? It means when you buy toothpaste or a gallon of gas, until 2 years ago, that money couldn't be used for a candidate who you didn't like. They had to raise the money separately. It wasn't like you were contributing to campaigns when you went to the store. So that was the wisdom of the American people for over 100 years. Then some people said, well, okay, if corporations can't do that, then unions shouldn't be able to do it either. And so when unions became more powerful in the 1940s, in that era, Congress passed something called the Taft-Hartley Act that had many provisions. But one provision said unions can't do it either. So unions haven't been able to use those mandatory union dues that union members pay for campaigns for 60 years. They have to raise it separately. They have to say to the union members, would you please contribute to a political action committee? And then there were limits on that. So that was the law. I never heard anyone say to me, prior to 2 years ago, well, you know, that's dumb. Why don't we change that? And it's not because I have any particular negative feeling about corporations expressing their views. As you know, perhaps you know, this isn't about corporations running ads about how they feel about issues. BP can run all the ads they want, and they always could, saying, hey, we're cleaning up the Gulf and we're providing jobs. This is only about their role in affecting and buying up huge role in our political campaigns and distorting the electoral process. What did the Supreme Court do? The Supreme Court said in Citizens United, never mind. They overturned those laws. They overturned the Tillman Act. They overturned the Taft-Hartley provision that I just mentioned. And so what we have now is a system of unlimited, undisclosed campaign contributions, in effect. They're supposedly independent, but now they can spend tens of millions of dollars supporting a candidate or opposing a candidate, and you don't even know where it's from. It's possible it's even indirectly from foreign interests, even though that's supposed to be illegal. And so you might say, well, wasn't it always like that? No. In 2004, 2006, and 2008, John McCain and I had passed our bill banning what was called soft money. So those were unlimited contributions to the political parties, but we'd gotten rid of that. So what happened in 2006 and 2008 is people couldn't do this, the corporations couldn't do it, the unions couldn't do it. So what happened? People turned to democracy. People turned to the internet. Politicians raised money through the internet from students for the first time. I saw contributions from students for 10, 25, 50 bucks. People were feeling included in the political process, which of course was one of the reasons why President Obama had a tremendous amount of volunteer support and otherwise. And this was all, in my view, improving the system and making it much more democratic. So the Supreme Court apparently didn't like it. I think corporate America didn't like it. I think they saw the face of democracy and they were terrified, and they engineered a decision that most law experts believe ranks way up there as one of the worst decisions in the history of the United States Supreme Court. You know, there are very few decisions that most folks know about. People don't run around going, hey, have you heard about this Supreme Court case? You know, that's not normal conversation. People have heard of Dred Scott, Brown versus Board, Roe v. Wade, Bush v. Gore, but they've heard of Citizens United. It's a handful of cases, and they know it's not good. So unless you want a system where unlimited contributions dominate our political process, unless you want a system where you don't even know where the money's coming from and where these ads are from, this has to be turned around. And this isn't about hating corporations. And I went on Stephen Colbert. I was actually in a studio in Milwaukee, and that's a tough thing to do. I'm fine with Meet the Press, but Colbert gets on before, and he comes on real nice and says to me, now, Russ, you know, I just play a character here. And I'm an idiot, he says. So your job is to set me straight. And I said, well, okay, that sounds good. Of course, comes on the air and he goes, tonight we have a special guest, recently deposed United States Senator Russ Feingold, like I was Hosni Mubarak or somebody. And he goes, Mr. Feingold, what do you have against corporations? Do you hate corporations? If you see a corporation walking down the street, do you cross the street? Would you let your daughter date a corporation? I said no, but I said, you know, this isn't about not believing that corporations are an important part of our economy. It's about whether it's a good idea to let this kind of money flow around our political system in a way that we have not done for over 100 years. I mean, it's without a doubt corrupting. When people have conversations like that, asking for that kind of money with no disclosure and no reporting, there are probably bad things being said. We say in this great middle section of the country, there's no such thing as a free lunch. I would postulate there's also no such thing as a free $10 million contribution. It's highly unlikely. So there's great corruption going on. John McCain says there will be a scandal. I say there is now a scandal going on. Those conversations are being held tonight. You can bet on it because of all the money that's being raised. And we don't know, because we don't have the investigative reporters and the ability to find out. We don't know what's going on with your democracy and my democracy, and this has to be unveiled so we can overturn Citizens United. How do you overturn it? Well, either one of the justices has to change his mind, and in this case it is his. There are no women that voted that way. Or we get a couple new justices. And of course that debate tonight will affect who gets to pick those justices. Needless to say, one of the reasons I support the president and I'm one of the co-chairs of his campaign is I think there's at least a chance he would appoint somebody who might think it's a good idea to overturn this decision. I don't think there would be a great chance of that the other way, but we can talk about that in the question and answer period. So I'll conclude this first part by simply saying, it's up to you. Do you want to live, especially young people here, in a democracy where all the big conversations and decisions about how campaigns are funded are behind closed doors, which you have nothing to do with? Or do you want to feel like your contributions and your volunteering and your knocking on doors and perhaps you're running for office, which I hope you'll consider doing, will mean something? This is a fundamental issue for your future and for our time. Second thing, what's wrong with the United States Senate? Well, quite a bit. I had the privilege of serving there for 18 years. It was the greatest honor of my life. But, I tried to be aware of what the purpose of the United States Senate was from the beginning. I had a chance to talk to some of you in a class today about that. Well, the story goes that when the Constitution was drafted in Philadelphia, Thomas Jefferson was not present. He was in France. And so James Madison and others did this brilliant draftman's work. Jefferson came back and had breakfast with George Washington. And apparently Jefferson said to Washington, "Why did you create the Senate like this?" He was confused about why it was created in this way with the 6-year terms as opposed to the 2-year terms. Senators were selected not by direct vote but by state legislatures. And the claim or the story, even if it may be apocryphal, is that Washington took his coffee cup and saucer and poured the hot coffee into the saucer. And he said, "The Senate is to be to the Congress and our system of government as the saucer is to this coffee, the cooling saucer. The cooling saucer of our democracy." In other words, the House, directly elected, majority vote, things can go pretty quickly. The Senate's role was to take more time, to consider, to debate, to sort of be the wise old men. At that time, of course, it was just men, who would consider and make sure things didn't move too quickly. It was a form of check and balance. That was the idea. And as you may know, the practice known as the filibuster was not something that was present at the time of the founding of our country. It was sort of occurred now and then in different forms in the 19th century. But the filibuster as a regular practice in the Senate didn't really occur to the 20th century. But there was no limitation on debate at all in the Senate. There had never been. It's just that people didn't use this technique. Now, this technique of a filibuster, which I assume you're all familiar with, where senators can keep talking indefinitely, was first used by a bunch of progressive and plain states and isolationist senators to try to prevent our entry into World War I in 1917. So it was Woodrow Wilson who first demanded that these so-called willful men be stopped, and they first created what's known as cloture. So that was the first time, in 1917, when a rule was established that said if you can get a supermajority, and in that time it was, I think, 2/3 of the Senate, of the senators present, you could cut off debate. First time that was ever allowed in the country. And they've gone back and forth in the 20th century on how this should be used. It got a very bad name in the 1950s and 60s when Southern senators used the filibuster successfully because they had all the seniority to stop any civil rights legislation. There had been no civil rights legislation since the 19th century of any substance at all, till Lyndon Johnson decided he wasn't going to be voting against civil rights bills as he had been doing. He wasn't going to be part of the filibuster. He decided as majority leader that he would pass civil rights legislation and beat the filibuster. But the filibuster got a really bad name when I was growing up. Once the civil rights bills got through, though, the filibuster got back to being used as a thing that, I think has its place in our society. If you feel passionately about an issue, an individual senator or two backing up your state, it's an opportunity to go to the floor and say, wait a minute, I'm going to talk for a long time because I don't want you to do this to us. Bill Proxmire of Wisconsin talked for like 23 hours in favor of an anti-genocide treaty. Strom Thurmond, I think, had the record for about 28 hours. And remember, when you're doing a filibuster, you can't sit down, you can't go out and get lunch, you can't even go to the bathroom. So this is a tough gig. And I can't even imagine doing this. I did sort of a mini filibuster once when they were trying to take it to the dairy industry in Wisconsin. You care about the dairy industry here. We are the land of the cheeseheads. And there's certain national laws that were important to us in terms of the way the pricing was done. And the New England senators put together a provision. They stuck it in a housing bill that was going to basically rip us off. So I had my staff collect some materials for me, and out to the Senate floor I came, and I got the president to call on me, and I took the floor. And I had with me all these cookbooks with cheese recipes and the history of cheese. You can look it up, and these days you can look it up in 2 seconds, but you'll find in the congressional record me explaining to people that, of course, we all know that Camembert is the king of cheeses. I sat there for like 2.5 hours blabbering away with this stuff. And finally, the senator who was in charge of the legislation was very angry. She was the shortest but also the toughest member of the Senate, Senator Mikulski of Maryland. You don't really want to cross her. But I did. And finally she said, how long does a senator intend to speak? And I said, as long as this lousy provision's in the bill. So she talked to somebody and they took it out. So it has its role. But the message I want you to get tonight is that even at its worst, the filibuster was not used all the time to stop all legislation, and in particular, the filibuster was not used for partisan purposes. It wasn't Democrat versus Republican. It was dairy guy versus dairy guy. Westerner versus Easterner. It wasn't about party battles. And in fact, I'm sure many of you have read some of the early history of the country and the founding fathers, their greatest concern was the political parties. They didn't want political parties. They feared that it would ruin this system. And the Senate was supposed to be a place where faction, is what they called the parties, where faction would be limited. What do we have now? The complete abuse of this system. And I saw it happen during the 18 years that I was in the Senate. Gradually was used more and more by both parties. Whoever was out of office would start a filibuster on basically everything. And then abuse occurred on the majority side. They'd immediately file a petition for cloture to cut off debate before the bill had even started. So that's how you get a logjam. And that's how you get a situation where basically nothing can get done in the United States Senate. And so it's fair enough that people are saying we have to change the filibuster. Many people are saying let's get rid of it. Common Cause, a group that I greatly respect and that I worked with on campaign finance reform, has filed a lawsuit to have the filibuster declared unconstitutional. In other words, that if the Constitution doesn't say you need a supermajority like in a treaty, that it's illegal to have a rule asking for 60 votes to cut off debate. It should be just 50. Well, I think that goes too far. I think there is a cooling saucer role for the Senate, but it shouldn't be used every time. As one of my students at Marquette University Law School said when I brought up this whole cooling saucer thing, he said, sounds more like it's a deep freezer than a cooling saucer. So this needs to be fixed for our system of government to work, but it can be fixed. One thing you could do is instead of it having to be 60 votes to cut off debate, right now all 60 senators who want to cut off debate have to be there, and the rest can be in the Bahamas. So for example, the Democrats want to get a bill going, and the Republicans can go to the Bahamas for the weekend, and all the Democrats still have to be there, and vice versa. So if you changed it so that it's 60% of those present, those who showed up, that would change it all, because senators like their weekends. Finally, on this point, even though I am very interested in the history of this and I want to fix it and I want to make sure the Senate works right, in the end it has more to do with you than it has to do with the Senate. If you demand of your elected officials, not that they fight with each other and never work with the other side, but that you only give them credit if they prove to you that they are working with the other party, they'll do it. The response that I got when I worked with John McCain was overwhelmingly positive. They didn't even know what the bill was. And people were like, good, the election's over, let's work together. But the last 2-3 years, the message being given to both parties is, if you work with the other side, you're a traitor. The Republicans coined the term, but Democrats do similar things. They call Republicans that work with the other side rhinos. Republicans in name only. So Lindsey Graham, who's not exactly a liberal, conservative senator from South Carolina, was working on some kind of a watered-down climate change bill with John Kerry, and he was attacked and censured, condemned, by the South Carolina Republican Party for being a traitor. This isn't good for our country. And so I hope, as the candidates, and this is the time to get them because they're all coming around now, this is the most vulnerable time for a candidate. You can get them to promise a lot of stuff, and they might even keep the promise because they want your vote. Say, I'm going to vote for you, but in 2 years or 4 years, when you come back and you can't tell me who you worked with in the other party and what you got done, I'm not voting for you again. The politicians will follow if you demand bipartisanship, and I think it's high time that we do that. The last topic is foreign policy. I was recently at a speech like this where the questions that I got were not exactly carefully honed questions. It was like, talk about Africa, talk about China. It's like I didn't know even where to begin. But let me just begin with the reason that I wrote this book called While America Sleeps. This tells a story of, my being in Washington and on 9/11, and all of us had our interesting, horrifying experiences with it. But there was one thing that came out of it that I was sort of encouraged by. For a brief time there, it seemed to me like people were going to put aside partisan differences, at least on this, and that we were going to work together to figure out how did we not see this coming? How can we work together to understand the world better? How can we sort of be ahead of these things instead of waiting to be surprised? And so the book is called While America Sleeps. It's a takeoff on something that related to Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill had given a lot of speeches on the floor of the House of Commons when he was in the opposition for many years, warning the British people that the Germans were rearming and that their intentions weren't good. Neville Chamberlain and others were kind of playing footsie with the French and all others, and they weren't really focused on this. And so Churchill, as only Churchill could do, gave these speeches. Some of them were very mechanical about airplanes and machines and so on. But he basically said to the British people, we have been an island people, obviously, throughout our history. We haven't been subjugated for 1,000 years. We believe because of our island status that we're invulnerable. It's hard for us to realize how dangerous the rest of the world can be. You know what? Those words reminded me of us. We built this great nation in part because of the resources we had, and that we had these two huge oceans generally protecting us from the rest of the world and not having to be involved in every kind of foreign conflict and war. We know that. In a way, we're like an island people. But that world no longer exists. The world now is interconnected with the internet and military capacities and economically in a way that we can never afford to not understand what's happening in the rest of the world. I mean, I experienced this on this 9/11 thing, where I remember seeing that there were simultaneous attacks in Kenya and Tanzania and our embassies on the same day. And I thought, wow, what kind of a group is able to do that? And I think many of us who were old enough to remember this whole series of events sort of thought, well, okay, we didn't really get it. The same thing happened when they attacked the USS Cole in Yemen and Aden Harbor. They just took a boat right into a ship, killed 17 American sailors, including one from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. And I remember I was in Fox Studios, actually, at the time when I heard the news, and I got this chill from it, thinking this is really terrible. But we didn't really understand Yemen or some of these places in a way that allowed us to evaluate it. I even remember when the Taliban announced that they were going to knock out and destroy those incredible stone Buddhas in Bamiyan in Afghanistan, these amazing accomplishments of human beings. I thought, they're not going to do that. Nobody would do that. Hitler didn't even destroy St. Paul's or the Oxford colleges, probably because he wanted to use them. I didn't think they'd do it. They did it. And I remember when we finally had the attack thinking, how is it that we were preoccupied at the same time, not with understanding this threat around the world, but with things like trying to impeach Bill Clinton, who, of course, had misbehaved, but did we need 7 weeks in the United States Senate of a trial on Monday through Saturday to try this while the rest of the world was experiencing some of this turmoil and we weren't getting ahead of it? But as I said, I thought we got off to a good start after 9/11. I thought George Bush's speech in the Congress about 3 weeks after 9/11 was the best speech I ever heard by a president. I got to hear a lot of them there. I heard a lot of good ones by Bill Clinton, but they were always really long. This was a crisp speech that hit all the right messages. Colin Powell got us off to the right start in terms of the war in Afghanistan. I supported the war in Afghanistan. I don't anymore because I think it's gone on way too long, but at the time the whole idea was, hey, these guys attacked us. We had every right to go after bin Laden and the others and the Taliban at that point. But the way he did it was careful. He took some time. He went and visited the various Islamic countries and lined them up, even ones that hadn't been with us in the first Gulf War. And so that was done right. And then, almost astonishingly to me, because I was really following this closely, the president and the administration decided it was a good idea to invade Iraq. And I really was bewildered. Because the president had said effectively, including in that speech, you know, there are 60 countries where al-Qaeda is operating. We will not tolerate al-Qaeda or anybody who harbors them. So I took a look at the list after this Iraq proposal was made, and there were a bunch of countries on the list I had heard of. Afghanistan, Turkey, Uzbekistan, Ireland, Britain. Guess what country wasn't even on the list? Iraq. So then we go and invade Iraq. And then the whole game became, for the next many years, not just the Bush administration, which basically said that was the central focus on the war on terrorism, but various Democrats who had voted for the war all sort of got into this idea of, well, we have to justify the Iraq thing, so they tried to fit the whole idea of al-Qaeda into justifying the Iraq invasion, which made no sense. I mean, this included people like John Kerry, John Edwards, and Hillary Clinton, all of whom voted for the war. And so we got completely sidetracked. I've compared it to a game of Risk, and I'm always relieved when younger people know what I'm talking about. Thank God you guys do know what Risk is. But, you know, Risk, one of the rules in Risk is when you invade a country, you got to leave some of your troops there the whole game. You can't sort of move around. And that's what it seems like we started to do. It was like, we're going to do Afghanistan, then we're going to do Iraq, we're going to invade one country at a time, instead of thinking about the interconnections. The al-Qaeda network going from one place to another, and it's like a network, maybe a criminal network if you want to call it that, rather than sort of an old Cold War view of which country should we be concerned with. We seem to have trouble getting out of that mindset. Maybe we should think more about a different game of Scrabble. My mother was very good at Scrabble and would defeat me regularly. But the best player I ever played was a guy who sublet an apartment from me in the early 1970s. He was from Taiwan. His name was Ru Donghui. He was a biochemist. He was older than us. He couldn't understand why we just wanted to watch the Watergate hearings on TV. He couldn't relate to it at all. But he said to me, Russ, would you like to play Scrabble? And I thought, you know, this guy's English isn't the greatest. Sure, I'll play. He destroyed me. He got a 7-word score basically every time. So I got frustrated, and I said, Ru, you know, how does this work? How do you do this? He says, Russ, you must always think in 2 directions. You must always think in 2 directions. So you're going to hear a lot of stuff tonight about Libya, right? Because that's the country of the day. But the truth is that if you can't think about the interconnections of the different countries in northern Africa and their connection to the countries in the Middle East, we're not going to understand this enemy or a lot of other things. The country of Algeria. Algeria was basically part of France. They had annexed it. The Algerian people had to fight very hard for their freedom in the late 1950s and early 1960s. They got that freedom, finally, after a brutal struggle. But the same people have been running Algeria ever since, and in the early 1990s, there was an election. And an Islamic party, a moderate Islamic party, won a preliminary election. The government panicked and called off the main elections. In stepped 3,000 people who created what's called a Salafist organization, which is a hardcore fundamentalist Islamic organization, the GSPC. 3,000 Algerians. But in terms of this whole think in two directions thing, they hadn't just been hanging out in Algeria. They had just spent several years in Afghanistan with bin Laden learning about the principles of jihad. And they came back to Algeria and they radicalized as many people as they could, and they tortured and killed the others who wouldn't go along with them. The government of Algeria reacted bitterly and used brutal tactics on them as well. And finally, after 10 years, they pushed the GSPC out into the southern Algeria, into countries like Chad, the Central African Republic, and Mali. And they were on their last legs. And all of a sudden, 9/11 occurs, and they've decided this is what we're going to do. We're going to become a chapter of Al-Qaeda. So they've renamed themselves Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM. They're a chapter of Al-Qaeda, and they're rejuvenated. Think in two directions? Guess what these guys are doing now? They're not so much in Algeria. They've taken over northern Mali. The northern half of the country of Mali, which is where Timbuktu is, they had a coup in that country. It's now run basically by Al-Qaeda. Anybody telling you about this? Have we seen this movie before? Where these threats are going on around the world, and frankly, we have a discussion in the presidential primaries where people aren't even talking about it. The only thing they'll say is to criticize the president about not being tough enough for Iran. You know, they're looking for some silver bullet to try to figure out something wrong with what he's doing. Instead of a national conversation about how we can learn about these places and get ahead of the game. So there's a lot more in the book, which I urge you to get. But, you know, what do we do about it? Well, this isn't about partisan politics. This is about all of us, including me, doing a better job of learning about the rest of the world. When I was teaching at Marquette, I picked up a Marquette Tribune, their local student newspaper. And one of the students had written a column entitled, "Where in the World is Tunisia?" at the beginning of the Arab Spring. And he just said, why is it, I'm a good student, why is it I don't even know where this place is? Is it an important place? Why is it that we don't know how to spell Kyrgyzstan, but we do know how to spell Kardashian, he wrote, which I thought was a great line. The truth is, our leaders and all of us somehow need to be concerned about understanding and connecting with the rest of the world. We need to learn foreign languages. My mother knew 6 languages fluently, and I thought it'd be a good idea not to learn any. What a dumb thing. What a danger for our society and our military and our intelligence that we don't have that. I think that, for example, we ought to make sure our members of Congress are a little more tuned into this. I think we should assign a country to every member of Congress that they have to learn about, come back home and say, I've been assigned Nigeria, I've been assigned Japan. Let's all talk about this together at a forum rather than always fighting across political lines. And this isn't some harebrained idea. The founders actually put in there that the Senate has to approve all ambassadors and all treaties. So my thought is it's kind of nice if they know where the country is before they vote. This is what I think we need to do. So this is a very shortened version of my plea that we as a country, whatever our partisan differences are domestically, maybe there is a way we could make it a national project to be a little more concerned and get ahead of the game overseas. As students told me all across the country in the last 2 years who come from other countries. Senator, we know a lot more about you than you know about us. And I don't think that's the safest thing in the world. So those are my 3 topics. It's great to be here. I'll be happy to answer some questions. I would urge you to come up to the microphones, and whoever has to leave, that's cool, but, you know, students should not feel shy here. I love it when the students, I'm happy to have others speak, but let's have a question or two. Yes, sir.
Was the Senate able to pull out the troops back after taking out Saddam Hussein? Because I heard Saudi Arabia was in a TV interview, one of the Saudi princes, and he mentioned that after America took out Saddam Hussein, Saudi Arabia turned around and said, I believe that you should pull out your troops. Was the Senate able to pull out the troops at that point, or
No.
they had no control over that?
Well, in theory, we could have I was the first senator to propose a time frame to get us out of Iraq, which I proposed in 2005. And I wanted us out of there within a year. We should have gotten out of there much earlier. It was a mistake to go in. It was a mistake to stay there that long. And it did not further our long-term priorities in the world. We could have passed a resolution. I think it would have put pressure on President Bush. He wouldn't have signed it out. It wouldn't have been if it's a resolution, he doesn't sign it. But it would have put a great deal of pressure on the president, and he didn't do it. Now, the reason Obama became president in part was that he pledged to get our troops out of Iraq, and he did do that. Longer than I wanted. I also disagree with his decision to increase the troops in Afghanistan, and I think we should be getting out of Afghanistan immediately. This isn't justified anymore. Yes, we could have had an impact. I don't think we could have literally caused us to get out at that point.
Thank you.
You bet. Go ahead.
Mr. Senator, you have stated that you disapprove of the current campaign finance system and the Supreme Court stance on it. Would you propose simply a return to the prior system as established in the early 1900s and by yourself and Senator McCain, or are there specific changes that you would see further made?
Good question. And, when John McCain and I did this, we believed it was only one of the steps that needed to be taken. We were in a better position because this unlimited money couldn't go through political parties. We need to overturn Citizens United to stop these unlimited, undisclosed contributions. But we need to do more. We need to get public financing, voluntary public financing, for all elections in this country. We have to fix the one for the presidency. We've never had it for Congress, and I think the state should do it as well. That's where people voluntarily agree to limit how much they spend in return for getting reduction in the cost of their television time or something like that. We also need to get rid of what's called the Federal Elections Commission. It's a joke. It's not working. It's completely blocked. We need an enforcement agency to enforce our election laws. What good does it do to overturn Citizens United if we don't have an agency that can actually do the job? And so there are quite a few other things that we could do, but those are three that come to mind. And we need to pass what's called the Disclose Act. The Disclose Act in Congress, and they're also trying to do it at the state level at different places, would at least tell us what these contributions are. And the Citizens United Court did vote 8-1, saying that disclosure is not only allowed, but is basically, they said, recommended, which is an unusual thing for the court to say. So there's a full agenda of things, but it won't work if we don't also overturn Citizens United.
Thank you.
Before I ask my question, I want to thank you for voting against the Patriot Act. It took a lot of courage, and I think you upheld your oath to defend and uphold the Constitution of the United States. My question has to do with Iran and Israel. President Obama has taken a lot of flack for trying to cool out Benjamin Netanyahu and his government from preemptively attacking Iran, but they have been beating the war drum both in the Israeli media and the American media, and there's certainly, you see it a lot, say on Fox News and talk radio. I think we know where President Obama stands on this at the present time, but the Republican candidate is known for flip-flopping. It's really hard to figure out what he really believes, but bearing in mind you're the co-chair of the re-election campaign, you want Obama to win. If Governor Romney won the election, is he going to move to the center on this issue and try and be pragmatic and prudent with the Israelis? or do you think he would greenlight the Netanyahu regime?
That's an interesting guessing game, and I certainly don't say this as a co-chair of the Obama campaign. My guess is he wouldn't be nearly aggressive as he's pretending to be right now. This is a pretense, trying to act like President Obama isn't strong on this issue. President Obama said in the State of the Union he would take no option off the table. I agree with President Obama that we cannot let the Iranians have a nuclear weapon. So we know what that means. If there's only one way to stop it, we'll do that. Or the Israelis will do it. But that's not the preferred route. And that's not what we should seek. What we should seek is to persuade the Iranians to do something else. And that's not a silly idea. Silly to try to persuade Saddam Hussein to do something because of the nature of his megalomania. But Iran is a much more complex country. You know, Ahmadinejad is not all-powerful. Khomeini, the chief Ayatollah, is not all-powerful. It is an ancient, complex country that has a real political system. And they are currently in real trouble politically because the sanctions are working. The rial, the Iranian currency is plummeting because of the oil sanctions that the international community has put in Iran. Internally, the people of Iran, I think, are going to demand that they not go this route. And believe me, that is strongly preferred to blustering and threatening an invasion that, frankly, would be very, very costly for everyone. An invasion of Iran would not be like invading, like Liberia when we tried to get rid of Charles Taylor. This would be a completely different, far more difficult than what we did in Iraq. And so, again, I'm going to say it again. I am not a pacifist. I am not opposed to preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons, and I am willing to see steps taken, but that has got to be our last choice. So I assume Romney, in the end, if he wins, is not going to be excited about starting a war right away, but he shouldn't be using it as a political weapon against the president if that's what he's going to do. Come on up, drink the mics. You don't have to wait back there.
I was wondering if you could address some of the negative impacts the Patriot Act has had on U.S. citizens.
Negative impacts of the Patriot Act. It's hard to know for sure because this stuff's in secret. But just so you know, ever since 2001, your library records can be taken by the government basically just on the say-so that they want them. They don't have to prove that you're working with Al-Qaeda. They don't have to prove anything. They just have to say, we seek this guy's library records in connection with a terrorism investigation. It doesn't have to be that you're a suspect. That's never been fixed. There's sneak and peek searches. Under the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution, you have a right against unreasonable searches and seizures. It's in every movie. Do you have a search warrant? Well, there's an exception. Occasionally, people are allowed, if evidence is going to be destroyed or somebody's going to flee, to go to a judge and say, we need to get in this guy's house for just a week and then we'll give him notice. Well, the Patriot Act, on the ground that it was needed to fight terrorists, took the lid off of that and allowed it in many more situations for longer periods of time. And guess what? 2 years after the thing was passed, we found out they've been using it a lot. And not one single time for a terrorism investigation. It was because it was an opportunity to expand the powers of our government to intrude on our personal freedom. And so these things are a concern. I noticed that the Supreme Court, or the courts yesterday, refused to hear a case about the telephone companies. As far as I'm concerned, the telephone companies, against the laws of the United States, responded to a government request that wasn't properly set up for your telephone records. And now they're saying we can't sue the telephone companies for having violated the law. So the Patriot Act is not even close to having been fixed under either administration.
How can we protect ourselves from the invasions of privacy and invasions of our civil rights from the Patriot Act?
We have to change the law, but there also has to be some explanation from younger people about how you feel about this. And I want to be candid with the young people in the room. As an older guy, I've talked to a lot of young people in the last 2 years, and a lot of young people have told me that privacy is probably not as important to you as it was to us because of the world you live in, because it's so hard for anything to be private anymore anyway. So one thing I have to think about as a person that cares about these issues is, are young people really not concerned about that? Is this not a priority? Or are you concerned that your personal information and your personal effects and your personal communications are being invaded. I'm truly looking for guidance on this as I talk to people, but I still care a lot about it, and you can change it through legislation and through lawsuits, but it's very difficult because once your freedoms are taken away, it usually doesn't move in that direction. The more power the government gets, it's likely to keep those powers. It's not likely to give them up. So that's a danger. Good question.
Thank you. Going back to 9/11, how do you feel about when people say George Bush could have prevented the whole thing?
Could he have prevented 9/11?
Yeah.
Oh, I think in terms of 9/11, I think that's probably an unfair standard to hold him or Bill Clinton to. I think we were all not able to evaluate the intense danger of al-Qaeda. I think he was considered obviously a terrorist, but somebody that should be handled. He should have been taken out earlier. There was an attempt, but it failed. But, I'm not one who says, yeah, there was a memo that gave them some pretty good warning just before that this was serious. Whether or not they could have gotten him is another question. But I've never focused particularly on whether or not George Bush could have prevented 9/11. And I hope that the same thing goes for President Obama. The situation in Libya. This is being totally politicized. And neither Romney nor the White House did a good job on it. But when are we going to get away from looking at a crisis like that as an opportunity for domestic political points and try to work together as a people to try to understand it and prevent it from happening again? There's got to be some distinction between the domestic political battles and those kind of battles where we really could use some more unity in the face we give to the rest of the world. But I'm not going to go too heavy on the Bush thing there.
Earlier you said that one of the problems with our foreign policy is that we're focused more on places like Iraq and Iran instead of places like northern Mali. Do you think that has anything, do you think there's a reason for that? Maybe resources that those countries have, specifically oil?
Well, I don't think I said exactly the way you characterized it. I think we had a tendency to look at crises based on one country at a time. And certainly with regard to Iran, that's a completely legitimate and important concern. That's a terribly important concern. I just think we have a hard time holding more than 2, 3 places in our head at the same time. It's like, now we're going to do Iran, now we're going to do Yemen. It's like a myopia, a tunnel vision, if you will. That's my concern. Now, whether or not oil is a major factor, yes, of course it is. Robert Mugabe has turned the country of Zimbabwe into a disaster. And he's brutalized the people of his country in a way that is terrible. And, of course, we're less inclined to act in a situation like that, partly for the reason you said, and because it doesn't have that sort of same interconnection to other critical flashpoints in the region like these North African countries do. And one of the ironies of this thing in Mali is one of the reasons these guys are in Mali now is that the people that were protecting Gaddafi were Tuareg people from Mali who were over there doing that. They got kicked out, so they came back to Mali, and now they've got control of northern Mali, and they've linked up with al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb. And so it's easy to think about a place like Mali and say, well, who cares? We don't even know where that is. But these are all interconnected. I think we tend to get a little more concerned about places like that are interconnected than we do a place like Zimbabwe, which is a terrible situation as well.
Thank you.
I'd like to take it back to the local, and your local specifically, and hear a little bit about this past year with Scott Walker and collective bargaining and kind of what's happened and where we're going.
Well, it's not good. You may not have followed this, but I actually mentioned in my book that, when I left the Senate, there was the nuclear disaster in Japan, and there was the Arab Spring occurred, and there was that horrible shooting in Arizona of the congresswoman, and then there was the Cairo riots and mass protests in Tahrir Square. Came back to my hotel room in Milwaukee, and Candy Crowley, the one that's doing the debate tonight, said, she showed some photos. She goes, these scenes that you're seeing are not in Cairo, they are in Madison, Wisconsin. Because we had these huge protests against Governor Walker's sudden and really extreme decision to use every brutal tactic I've ever seen a Wisconsin governor use to eliminate our law that has long protected the rights of collective bargaining rights of public employees in Wisconsin. We were the first state to ever have collective bargaining for public employees back in the late 1950s. And he used the brutal tactics, didn't allow normal debate, and jammed it through the state Senate and the Assembly and passed it in what I consider to be essentially an illegal manner. And so the protests were incredible. We had, for months, 80,000 to 100,000 people regularly around the state capitol, completely peaceful, the biggest protests ever seen in the state of Wisconsin, some of the biggest ever in the country. And then we tried to recall them, which is an extremely difficult thing to do. Not necessarily a tactic that was likely to win, but people felt so frustrated. And so it was really a great campaign. I did think it was a justification for a recall, even though I'm generally very anti-recall. And our candidate was good, but we lost by about 8 or 9 points because the polls showed the people that voted actually wanted to keep collective bargaining. They were for Obama, but they didn't think a recall was a good idea. There's only been 2 recalls. Was Kansas the other one? There's only been 2 recalls in the history of the United States successfully. One was the one that let Arnold Schwarzenegger become governor of California, and the other one was in Nebraska or Kansas or somewhere. It's really hard to do. So now we're stuck with this guy, although he is under investigation, possibly for inappropriate campaign work done out of his county executive office. And he's up for election in 2014, but it's been a rough couple of years for us in Wisconsin. Well, very good. Oh, one more.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on this fiscal cliff that's threatening to derail the U.S. economy, and what should be the Democrats' strategy in the event Obama would win the election and the Democrats retain the Senate?
That's a big question. Well, clearly, the issue that I ran for the U.S. Senate on was getting rid of the American deficit at the time, which was the largest in American history. I worked with members of both parties, and we got rid of the deficit completely by the time Bill Clinton's terms were up. We need that attitude. Again, there can't be lines in the sand. Obviously, I disagree with the Republican idea that you can't use any further taxes on upper-income people. We can't do it that way. I think the president is right. This isn't class warfare. It's math. He's right. And the Democrats, the same thing. They can't protect every single program or not allow any changes at all, or Medicare and Medicaid, although I do think we have to have a pledge that the programs will continue, but there need to be changes. So we need to have that attitude going forward, and the president has actually proposed a budget that would move us a specific budget that would move us significantly in that direction. But somehow there has to be some agreement that all these different things are on the table. We don't exempt very wealthy people from helping us solve this problem. Thank you very much. Oh. You want to ask your question? Yeah, why don't you finish it off?
Yeah, Mr. Senator. I just wanted to ask you, about a week ago, a drone, Iranian-made drone launched from southern Lebanon, infiltrated Israeli airspace, got close to the nuclear reactor in Dimona and was shot down. And there are reports that the drone was sent back to the United States to be analyzed because they had feared some technology had been stolen from the downed drone in Iran. At the same time, there's also been reports that there's been cyber attacks on U.S. banks and Qatari and Saudi Arabian oil websites. Are we properly addressing this issue? Because I never hear anything about things as technology theft and cyber warfare.
I can't say for sure if it's all being properly addressed. I will tell you this. I was on the Senate Intelligence Committee for 5 years. And some of the sessions were about cyber war, and they were pretty hair-raising. The possibility of what can happen and the way in which countries are going back and forth at each other on this, as well as the possibility of even groups like Al-Qaeda and others being involved in it. I know that there's a lot of efforts going on. I'm not there anymore. And a lot of the stuff about drones and cyber war you're not going to hear about because it's classified. So people can't talk about it. But there has to be some public awareness of this drone problem, and it's a serious problem. I believe the drones are appropriately used in some cases, but I think they're being overused. in certain places in a way that's alienating more people than we're able to handle. But these are incredibly important issues, and it's really hard because how do you get access to it so you can evaluate it? Because a lot of it's in secret. So we have to figure out a way to distill enough so the American people can understand it and discuss it and think about it without giving away secrets to people that don't wish us well. It's good to be here at K-State.
As you all know, we have a tradition here at K-State of giving our distinguished guests something special. And in order to communicate, Senator, that we thought this was really special, we're not going to give you a Wildcat hat or a jacket or a sweatshirt, but something you can't order online, a football signed by the Bill Snyder.
That's pretty good.
And we thank you very much. You are special.
Thank you, Governor.